It is finally time for the Al Gore takedown video. But first, this is Andy with the Heartland Institute, bringing you more from climaterealism.com. So Al Gore, outside of maybe Greta Thunberg, is the most prominent voice in climate change alarmism. In my opinion, it started back in 2006 when An Inconvenient Truth came out. Now, I was in middle school at the time, and like every other middle school student out there, we were forced to watch it. So they were showing this to every kid in my generation. There's no wonder my generation is so freaked out by climate change. We were showing this crap in school. But maybe if people in my generation actually knew what Al Gore is doing behind the scenes, they'd be a little less worried. So let's talk about it. To start, let's talk about what Al Gore was doing back in 2004. In 2004, Al Gore started the TV network Current TV, a leading voice in progressive news. But then, in 2013, he sold Current TV to Al Jazeera for $500 million. Al Gore reportedly profited about $100 million from this sale. Now, what's funny is where Al Jazeera gets its money from. So Al Jazeera is funded by the nation Qatar. Qatar receives the bulk of its money through the sale of, you guessed it, fossil fuels. So Al Gore sold his TV network to Al Jazeera, which is funded by Qatar, which receives its money from fossil fuels. So Al Gore reportedly profited about $100 million of fossil-fueled money from this sale. And it's not like Al Jazeera took Current TV and just kept going with it. No, not at all. They took Current TV, destroyed the whole thing, and then used its distribution network to start Al Jazeera America. So essentially, Al Gore started Current TV, sold it to Al Jazeera, which is funded by Qatar. He made $100 million, and that is fossil fuel money. Not a good look, Al. Al Gore is involved in many other companies that benefit greatly from government policy and political pressure. But most importantly, Al Gore is making a nice chunk of change off these. So one of these companies is Beyond Meat. For those of you that don't know, Beyond Meat is one of the companies that produces a pseudo-meat, or a meat alternative. Does it taste like meat? Not really. Actually, so essentially I've tried it. When you take a bite of it, that first bite kind of tastes like meat, but then once you start chewing in the aftertaste, nothing like it. It's not as good. These meat alternatives are highly processed themselves and contain a ton of ingredients, which are peas, mung bean, faba bean, brown rice, cocoa butter, coconut oil, canola oil, calcium, iron, salt, potassium, fluoride, beet juice extract, apple extract natural flavors, potato starch, methyl cellulose, sunflower lecithin, calcium alginate, and yeast extract. So yeah, there are a lot of ingredients in these. But here's the actual connection to Al Gore. So it starts with the World Resources Institute, or WRI. WRI receives funding from a large pool of wealthy radical environmental organizations. Then it uses this funding to put out research that says, yeah, climate change is terrible and it's humans' fault. Al Gore was on the organization's board of directors. WRI has put out studies that say that meat consumption is going to be the factor in pushing current temperature levels above 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is the apparent tipping point for humanity. Once that happens, we're done. Being on the board of directors, Al Gore clearly has a heavy hand in deciding what research WRI puts out. In 2005, Al Gore co-founded Generations Investment Management, an investment firm that considers sustainability as well as social and environmental impact when investing in business ventures. In 2007, Generations Investment Management cozied up to the firm Kleiner Perkins. Al Gore was brought on as a senior partner and advisor, but here's where it gets interesting. Kleiner Perkins is the largest investor in the meat alternative company Beyond Meat, owning a 16% stake in the $9.4 billion company. And again, Al Gore is a senior partner of Kleiner Perkins. And here's how it all ties together. Al Gore co-founded Generation Investment Management. 2 years later, Generation Investment Management cozied up to Kleiner Perkins. Al Gore is brought on as a senior partner. Kleiner Perkins is the largest investor in Beyond Meat, an alarmist climate group that Al Gore is on the board of directors of and gets to decide what research they puts out tons of research that says we need to stop eating traditional meat and eat Beyond Meat. So anytime these studies come out, they push people towards Beyond Meat, and Al Gore profits quite a bit more. Al Gore is also heavily involved with the United Nations. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, put out a report in 2019 pushing for less meat consumption globally. Al Gore clearly could have influenced this, something he will also profit off of. And there's more. In a 2008 TED Talk, Al Gore put up a list displaying 11 clean energy companies he predicted could help the slow of the coming climate catastrophe. Al Gore is obviously invested in some of these companies. But then, during the Obama administration, the federal government used $40 billion of taxpayer money towards a green stimulus package. According to a 2012 Washington Post report, 14 green tech firms that Al Gore is invested in received or benefited directly from grants, loans, and tax breaks from the government. Al Gore could have easily used his political influence to direct this government money. Does Al Gore at least live a carbon-free lifestyle? No. Here's one example. Al Gore owns a very large house in Tennessee. Gore definitely doesn't want you to know this, but I've compiled some statistics on the energy use of this house. The energy use of Al Gore's house in Tennessee uses more energy per year than the average American family will use in 21 years. The house has a pool. The energy used to heat that pool would power 6 American houses for an entire year. And that's not even getting into Al Gore's California mansion. But here's how Al Gore justifies all this. He says he buys carbon offsets. Now, it's well known that many of these carbon offset companies are scams. All you have to do is write a check for a couple $100 and all your carbon's gone. It's literally the easiest scam in the world. Now, in an article published in the peer-reviewed journal Nature, Kevin Anderson, deputy director of the Tyndall Center for Climate Change Research, argues that carbon offsets are worse than doing nothing. His quote is, "For an offset project to be genuinely low carbon," he argues, "it must guarantee that it does not stimulate further emissions over the subsequent century, which is," he says, "impossible to quantify without any meaningful level of certainty." The final point Anderson makes is that if you really want to cut CO2 emissions, you should do it yourself instead of supposedly paying someone to do it for you. Al Gore flies around the world in private jets, owns a massive house in Tennessee, and a $9 million mansion in California. I don't think he wants to do it himself. Also, a 2016 report, which I'll link below, found that 85% of carbon offset programs had a low likelihood of creating any real impact. Here's the moral of this whole thing. Al Gore is clearly using the climate change narrative to enrich himself. You could argue that he's just putting his money where his mouth is, but when he sold his current TV network to Al Jazeera, which is funded by Qatar, which receives its money from fossil fuels, it kind of blows up that narrative. After Al Gore's failed presidential run, he was worth approximately $1.7 million. In the years since pushing the climate change narrative, he's made reportedly $298 million. This is a profitable business, and I'm clearly on the wrong side here. So is Al Gore a climate hypocrite? Yes. But tell me what you think. Write in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed this video. It's Andy Singer with the Heartland Institute. Till next time, peace.